My name is Lorraine. I'm 63 years old. And that was the moment my own son spat on 24 hours of my love and labor. We'll feed it to the dogs. For words. For simple words that carved themselves into my chest like a blade finding bone. I stood there in that gleaming kitchen, their kitchen, with its marble countertops and imported fixtures, watching my daughter-in-law's lips curl around those words while my son nodded his agreement. The casserole I'd spent my morning preparing, the dessert I'd baked from scratch, the love I'd poured into every measuring cup and every careful stir, all of it reduced to dog food in their eyes. That was the moment I learned what it feels like when home spits you out. The shock hit first, a cold wave that started in my stomach and spread outward until my fingertips went numb. 27 people filled their dining room, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings, and not one of them looked at me. Not one of them saw the woman who'd driven 40 minutes through traffic, who'd risen at dawn to prepare their feast, who'd spent her pension money on ingredients because she wanted everything to be perfect for their housewarming party. They saw an inconvenience. A burden. An old woman whose food wasn't good enough for their sophisticated palates. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. My son, my flesh and blood, the boy I'd nursed through midnight fevers and teenage heartbreaks, couldn't even meet my eyes. He picked at his phone instead, scrolling through whatever meaningless drivel commanded more attention than his mother's presence. Well, I said, and my voice sounded strange in my own ears, hollow and distant. I suppose I should pack this up then. Nobody offered to help. Nobody protested. They simply watched as I moved through their kitchen like a ghost, wrapping dishes in aluminum foil with hands that shook despite my best efforts to steady them. The conversations resumed around me, flowing over and past me as if I'd already disappeared. The walk to my car felt endless. Each step across their pristine lawn carried the weight of every sacrifice I'd made, every dream I'd deferred, every moment I'd chosen my family over myself. The paper bags cut into my palms, and I welcomed the pain because it was honest, unlike the smiles they'd worn when I'd first arrived, unlike the hollow thanks they'd offered when I'd placed my offerings on their kitchen island. Behind me, their house blazed with light and laughter. The sound followed me down the street, mocking and distant, until finally the darkness swallowed it whole. I drove home in silence, my radio switched off, the weight of humiliation pressing down on my chest like a stone. The streets blurred past my windshield, familiar and foreign all at once. This wasn't the route home from visiting family. This was the drive of shame, the journey of the discarded. My small apartment waited for me in darkness. One bedroom, one bathroom, a kitchen barely large enough for one person to stand comfortably. The contrast with their mansion hit me like a physical blow. I set the bags on my tiny counter and stared at them, these containers full of rejected love, and something inside me finally broke. The tears came without warning, violent and raw. I collapsed into my kitchen chair and sobbed until my throat burned, until my chest ached, until there was nothing left inside me but the hollow echo of my son's indifference. The food grew cold around me, just as it had in their house, just as everything I touched seemed to grow cold these days. Through my thin walls, I could hear Mrs. Patterson's television, the laugh track of some late-night show bleeding through the plaster. She'd seen me coming home with the bags, I was certain. She'd probably tell Mrs. Chin tomorrow, and Mrs. Chin would tell her sister, and by the end of the week, the whole building would know that Lorraine's family didn't want her cooking. The whispers would follow me to the mailbox, to the laundry room, to the grocery store where I'd foolishly bought ingredients for people who saw my efforts as garbage. I poured myself a glass of wine with hands that still trembled, and I drank it slowly, tasting the bitterness on my tongue. Outside, the city continued its relentless pulse, millions of people living their lives, loving their families, belonging somewhere. And here I sat, alone in my kitchen at midnight, wondering when I'd become a stranger in my own son's life. The morning brought no relief, only the harsh light of reality filtering through my bedroom curtains. I'd slept poorly, my dreams filled with echoes of laughter and the taste of rejection. My coffee tasted like ash, and I found myself staring at my phone, waiting for something, an apology, an explanation, some acknowledgement that last night had happened at all. The call came at 10:15. Mrs. Blackwood? This is Jonathan Matthews from Matthews, Stevens and Associates. I represent your late husband's estate. I nearly dropped the phone. David had been dead for 3 years. His affairs settled long ago, or so I'd thought. I'm calling because we've discovered some documents that were previously misfiled. It appears your husband maintained certain property rights and business interests that weren't properly transferred upon his death. The lawyer's voice was crisp, professional, carrying the weight of words I didn't yet understand. He spoke of hidden assets, of controlling stakes, of legal documents that had been buried in bureaucratic red tape for years. And as he talked, a picture began to emerge that made my coffee cup rattle against its saucer. David, my quiet, methodical husband, had owned 49% of the restaurant chain that our son now managed. The business that my son believed he controlled, that he'd built his entire identity around, that financed his mansion and his lifestyle. David had owned nearly half of it, and now that ownership passed to me. The current managers, your son and his wife, they need your signature to proceed with their expansion plans. Without it, they cannot access the capital they need, cannot secure the loans they've arranged. Essentially, Mrs. Blackwood, you hold the power to approve or deny their future. I set down my coffee and laughed. It started as a chuckle, low and bitter, then built into something wilder, something that might have frightened me if I'd heard it from someone else's throat. The irony was so sharp it could cut glass. The woman they'd fed to the dogs now held their leash. Mrs. Blackwood? Are you there? Yes, I said, and my voice was steadier than it had been in years. Yes, I'm here. And Mr. Matthews? I think we need to talk. The messages started that afternoon. First a text from my daughter-in-law. Hi, Mom. Hope you're well. Can we chat sometime soon? The casual tone, the exclamation mark, as if last night had never happened, as if I hadn't left their house in shame while they plotted to feed my love to their dogs. I deleted it without responding. Then came my son's call. I watched his name flash on my screen, listened to the ringtone play once, twice, 3 times before it went to voicemail. His voice, when I played it back, carried a forced lightness that made my skin crawl. Hey Mom, just wanted to check in. Sarah mentioned you seemed a little upset last night. You know we were just kidding around, right? Family jokes and all that. Anyway, give me a call when you get this. Love you. Family jokes. As if the destruction of someone's spirit could be passed off as humor, as if the casual cruelty of their dismissal was something we could all laugh about later. I deleted that message too. More calls came throughout the week. Each one grew more desperate, more transparent. Mom, please call me back. Mom, we really need to talk. Mom, there's been a misunderstanding. The words changed, but the underlying panic remained constant. A high, thin note of anxiety that grew stronger with each unanswered ring. I spent my days in deliberate routine. Morning coffee, afternoon tea, evening wine. I read books I'd been meaning to get to for years, watched old movies that transported me to worlds where love was respected and family meant something beyond convenience. When the phone rang, I let it sing its little song and fall silent. When texts arrived, I glanced at them and felt nothing but a cool, distant satisfaction. Mr. Matthews called on Thursday with an update. The expansion deal was time-sensitive, he explained. Investors were growing nervous. Without my signature, the entire project would collapse within weeks. What exactly would happen then? I asked. Well, Mrs. Blackwood, the business would survive, certainly. But your son's plans for growth, his vision of expansion, that would die completely. The investors might even pull out of existing arrangements. It could be quite devastating for his current operations. I thanked him for the information and hung up. Then I made myself another cup of tea and sat by my window, watching the world go by. Somewhere across the city, My son was pacing his marble floors, calculating his losses, discovering what it felt like to need something from someone who had no reason to give it. The formal invitation arrived on Friday, hand-delivered by a courier service that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. Heavy cardstock, elegant script, embossed borders, everything designed to convey importance, respect, the gravity of the occasion. Mr. and Mrs. Richard Blackwood request the pleasure of your company for dinner at Le Bernardin this Saturday evening at 7 o'clock. Please confirm your attendance at your earliest convenience. I read it twice, running my fingers over the expensive paper. Le Bernardin, the kind of restaurant where David and I had gone once for our anniversary, where we'd spent a week's salary on a single meal and called it worth every penny. Now they were buying my attention with money they might not have much longer. I called and confirmed my attendance. Then I went shopping. I hadn't bought myself new clothes in 2 years, hadn't seen the point when my social calendar consisted mainly of grocery runs and doctor's appointments. But this called for something special, something that would announce my presence before I spoke a word. The dress was navy blue, simple but elegant, with a cut that flattered my figure and made me remember that I was still a woman worth looking at. The shoes were low heels, I wasn't 20 anymore, but they clicked against the pavement with authority. I had my hair done at a salon I'd always admired but never been able to afford, and the stylist worked magic with silver highlights that made me look distinguished rather than merely old. Saturday evening arrived with the crisp clarity of autumn. I took a taxi to the restaurant, watching the city lights blur past my window, feeling something I hadn't experienced in years: anticipation. Not nervousness, not dread, but the electric thrill of knowing that everything was about to change. Le Bernardin's entrance was all marble and crystal, designed to intimidate and impress in equal measure. The maitre d' recognized my name immediately, his professional smile never wavering as he led me through the dining room to a corner table where my family waited. They'd dressed for the occasion too. My son wore a suit that probably cost more than my rent, his wife draped in jewelry that caught the light with every gesture. But beneath their finery, I could see the strain, the tight lines around my son's eyes, the forced brightness of Sarah's smile, the way they both rose too quickly when they saw me approaching. "Mom," Richard said, and there was relief in his voice, as if my mere presence solved all his problems. "You look beautiful." I sat without responding to the compliment, arranged my napkin across my lap with deliberate care. The silence stretched between us, thick with unspoken tensions, and barely contained desperation. "How have you been?" Sarah asked, her voice pitched higher than normal. "We've been trying to reach you." "Have you?" I said mildly, accepting a menu from the hovering waiter. I hadn't noticed. The appetizers arrived, small plates of artfully arranged food that would have fed me for a week in terms of cost. My son attempted conversation. Business was good, the new house was perfect, Sarah's mother was visiting next month. Empty words floating across expensive china, filling space while the real conversation waited in the shadows. Finally, as the main course arrived, Richard cleared his throat and launched into what I knew was a rehearsed speech. "Mom, about last weekend, I think there was a misunderstanding. We never meant to upset you. You know how Sarah's with her jokes, and I just played along because we were all having fun. But we realize now that our timing was off, that maybe we were insensitive." Insensitive. As if they'd forgotten my birthday rather than mocking my love, as if their cruelty was merely a social miscalculation rather than a deliberate choice. And Sarah chimed in, leaning forward with practiced sincerity, "We want to make it right. We're planning another dinner party next month, and we want you to be our guest of honor. No cooking required, we'll handle everything. We just want you there as family." Family. The word sat between us like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples of irony across the conversation. "Speaking of family," Richard continued, his voice growing more nervous, "I actually wanted to talk to you about Dad's estate. Apparently, there were some documents that got misplaced when he died, and now they're saying you have some kind of ownership stake in the restaurants. It's probably just a paperwork error, but our lawyers need your signature to clear it up so we can move forward with our expansion plans." There it was. The real reason for the invitation, the expensive dinner, the sudden flood of attention. Not love, not family, not even genuine remorse, just need. Raw, desperate need dressed up in apologies and excuses. I cut a piece of my salmon and chewed it slowly, savoring both the flavor and the tension that radiated from across the table. They waited for my response, their faces masks of forced calm while their eyes betrayed their panic. "Family," I said finally, setting down my fork. "You want to talk about family?" "Of course, Mom. We're all family here. Are we?" I met my son's eyes across the table, saw him flinch at what he found there. Because last weekend, when I brought food made with my own hands, prepared with hours of my own time, offered with a heart full of love for my family, what did you call it? The color drained from Sarah's face. Richard opened his mouth, but no words came out. "You said you'd feed it to the dogs," I continued, my voice quiet, but carrying clearly across the intimate space of our corner table. "My love, my effort, my attempt to contribute to your celebration, you reduced it to garbage fit only for animals." "Mom, please." I'm not finished. The authority in my voice surprised even me. For 63 years, I've been someone's daughter, someone's wife, someone's mother. I've measured my worth by how well I served others, how completely I could disappear into their needs and their wants. And last weekend, you showed me exactly how much that service was worth to you. My son's hands trembled as he reached for his water glass. "It was a mistake. We didn't mean." "You meant every word." I reached into my purse and withdrew the contract documents Mr. Matthews had prepared, setting them on the table between the breadbasket and the flower arrangement. "Just as I mean every word I'm about to say." The papers lay there like an accusation, legal and official and utterly damning. Richard's eyes fixed on them with the intensity of a drowning man spotting a life preserver. "This isn't about money," I said, watching them both lean forward despite themselves. "This isn't about business or expansion or whatever grand plans you've made for the future. This is about respect. This is about recognizing that the woman who gave birth to you, who raised you, who loved you even when you made it impossible, this is about understanding that she has value beyond her usefulness to you." "We know that, Mom. We've always known that. Have you?" I touched the edge of the contract with one finger. "Because if you truly knew that, if you truly believed that I mattered as a person rather than just a resource you could use and discard, then last weekend would never have happened. You would have thanked me for the food, even if you didn't like it. You would have included me in your conversations, even if my opinions bored you. You would have treated me like family instead of like hired help you couldn't wait to dismiss." The silence that followed was deafening. Other diners continued their conversations around us, wine glasses clinked, silverware chimed against plates, but at our table the air had turned thick with recognition and consequence. Sarah tried one last desperate gambit. "Lorraine, we're sorry. We're truly, deeply sorry. We'll do anything to make this right. Just tell us what you want." What did I want? I wanted to be 18 again, standing in a wedding dress while my young husband promised to love and cherish me. I wanted to be 35 again, holding my newborn son and believing that love could conquer anything. I wanted to matter to someone, to be essential rather than convenient, to be missed when I was gone rather than dismissed when I was present. But none of those things were possible. The only thing within my power was this moment, this choice, this opportunity to teach my son what it felt like to be vulnerable to someone else's whims. I stood up, leaving the contract and signed on the table. "What I want," I said, pulling on my coat, "is for you to understand that actions have consequences. That when you treat someone like garbage, they might eventually stop being available to clean up your messes." I walked away without looking back, leaving them with their expensive meal and their unsigned papers and their first real taste of powerlessness. Behind me, I heard Sarah's voice rise in panic, heard my son call my name, but I didn't slow down. The maitre d' held the door for me with professional discretion, and I stepped out into the cool night air feeling lighter than I had in years. The taxi ride home was a blur of city lights and possibilities. For the first time in decades, I held power over my own life, control over my own destiny. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but I knew it would be different. I knew it would be mine. The next few weeks unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche, each day bringing fresh reports of my son's mounting desperation. Mr. Matthews called regularly with updates that I received with cool detachment. The investors had grown nervous and pulled their funding. The expansion deal had collapsed entirely. The restaurant chain was struggling to meet its existing obligations without the capital infusion they'd counted on. I read about it in the business section of the newspaper, my son's name attached to headlines about failed ventures and broken promises. The reporters painted him as overambitious, someone who'd reached too far and grasped nothing but air. They had no idea that his downfall rested in the hands of a 63-year-old woman who'd spent her life making casseroles and birthday cakes, who'd been dismissed as irrelevant by the very people who now needed her most. The phone calls continued, growing more frantic with each passing day. Richard left voicemails that progressed from cajoling to pleading to barely controlled hysteria. Sarah sent text messages that devolved from forced cheerfulness to outright begging. I listened to them all, read every word, and felt nothing but the cold satisfaction of justice delayed, but not denied. Mrs. Patterson cornered me by the mailboxes one afternoon, her eyes bright with curiosity and barely concealed glee. She'd seen the newspaper articles, heard the neighborhood gossip, and wanted to know if the rumors were true. Was I really the woman holding up the restaurant deal? Was my son really losing everything because I wouldn't sign a piece of paper? I smiled and told her I couldn't comment on family business, but the way her eyes lit up told me the story would be all over the building by dinner time. Good. Let them talk. Let them whisper about the quiet woman in 4B who'd turned out to hold all the cards. Let them understand that even the most overlooked among us might have power they'd never imagined. The court date arrived on a Tuesday morning in November. The hearing was a formality, Mr. Matthews had assured me, simply a matter of having my ownership stake officially recognized and my right to approve or deny business decisions formally established. But I dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing the same navy dress I'd worn to dinner that night, adding a string of pearls that had been my mother's. The courthouse was all marble and mahogany, designed to inspire respect for the law and fear of its consequences. I sat in the gallery watching the proceedings with the detached interest of someone observing a play about someone else's life. The judge was thorough, asking questions about David's original investment, the legal precedents for delayed inheritance claims, the current status of the business in question. When he finally ruled in my favor, confirming my right to control my son's future, I felt nothing but quiet vindication. Richard and Sarah sat in the front row, their expensive lawyers whispering urgent consultations, their faces pale with the recognition of complete defeat. As the gavel fell, I caught my son's eye across the courtroom. He looked older than his 38 years, worn down by weeks of stress and sleepless nights, and the gradual understanding that his mother was not the pushover he'd always believed her to be. I stood to leave, gathering my purse and my coat with deliberate care. As I reached the aisle, Richard broke away from his lawyers and caught up with me. "Mom," he said, and his voice cracked like a teenager's. "Please. We can work this out. We can fix this." I stopped and turned to face him, this man who'd grown in my body, who'd learned to walk holding my hand, who'd once believed I could cure any hurt with a kiss and a Band-Aid. Time had worn us both down, changed us both in ways that couldn't be undone, but in that moment I saw him clearly, not as the successful businessman or the ungrateful son, but as the scared child he'd always been underneath it all. "Richard," I said, and I used the name I'd given him, not the nickname his friends preferred. "Do you remember when you were 7 and you broke Mrs. Henderson's window with your baseball?" His face crumpled with confusion. What does that have to do with? You came home crying because you thought she'd call the police, because you thought you'd ruined everything. And what did I tell you? He shook his head, clearly not understanding why I was dragging up ancient history when his present was collapsing around him. I told you that when we make mistakes, we have to face the consequences. That running away or making excuses only makes things worse. That the only way to fix something broken is to own up to what we've done and accept whatever comes next. Understanding began to dawn in his eyes, followed quickly by a fresh wave of desperation. I'm not running away, Mom. I'm trying to fix this. I'm trying to make it right. Are you? I shifted my purse to my other hand, feeling the weight of the court's decision settling around us like dust after an explosion. Or are you just trying to escape the consequences of treating your mother like garbage? It wasn't like that. It was exactly like that. My voice carried the authority of someone who'd finally learned her own worth. You reduced my love to dog food, Richard. You made it clear that my presence in your life was an inconvenience, my efforts an embarrassment. And now that you need something from me, you want to pretend that never happened. Tears ran down his face now, and part of me, the part that had rocked him through nightmares and celebrated his triumphs, wanted to comfort him. But a larger part, the part that had spent 63 years diminishing herself for other people's comfort, stood firm. The food I made for you was never for dogs, I said, stepping closer so he could see himself reflected in my eyes. It was for family. And now I see clearly I don't have one. I walked away then, leaving him standing in the courthouse corridor with his tears and his lawyers and his suddenly uncertain future. The autumn air bit at my cheeks as I emerged onto the street, but I welcomed its sharpness. Everything felt crisp and clear, defined in ways my life hadn't been for years. The taxi driver asked where I wanted to go, and I gave him my address automatically. But as we pulled away from the courthouse, I realized I could go anywhere now. I had money, more than I'd ever had, and time, and freedom from obligation. I could travel, could move to a warmer climate, could finally pursue the interests I'd set aside when I'd chosen to define myself entirely through service to others. The possibilities spread out before me like a highway with no visible end, each option as valid as the next. But for now, I was content to go home to my small apartment, to make myself a cup of tea, to sit by my window and watch the world go by while I decided what kind of woman I wanted to be in whatever years remained to me. Behind me, the courthouse grew smaller in the taxi's rear window, taking with it the last vestiges of the woman I'd been, the one who'd apologized for taking up space, who'd accepted crumbs and called them feast, who'd believed that love meant never asking for anything in return. That woman was gone now, replaced by someone who understood that respect must be earned, that family was a privilege that could be revoked, that silence could be the most powerful weapon in the right hands. I was Lorraine Blackwood, 63 years old, and I was finally free. The weeks that followed brought their own rhythm, their own small satisfactions. I woke when I wanted to wake, ate what I wanted to eat, spent my days reading books and watching movies and rediscovering parts of myself that had been buried under decades of self-sacrifice. The phone stopped ringing after a while, my son finally understanding that some bridges, once burned, could never be rebuilt. I heard through Mrs. Patterson's gossip network that the restaurant chain had been forced to close 2 locations, that Richard and Sarah had sold their mansion and moved to a smaller house across town, that their marriage was showing signs of strain under the financial pressure. I received this information with the same detachment I might feel hearing about strangers in the news, people whose lives had intersected with mine briefly, but who no longer held any claim on my emotions. Sometimes, late at night, I thought about the child he'd been, the young man full of dreams and ambitions who'd hugged me tight after his father's funeral and promised he'd always take care of me. But those memories felt like scenes from someone else's life, warm and distant and ultimately irrelevant to the woman I'd become. I was learning to take up space without apologizing for it, to speak my mind without softening every opinion with qualifiers and apologies. I was discovering that loneliness and solitude were not the same thing, that being alone by choice felt entirely different from being alone because no one wanted your company. The settlement from David's estate had made me comfortable, but more than that, it had made me powerful. I controlled my own destiny now, answered to no one's needs but my own. I could be generous or selfish, social or reclusive, forgiving or implacable, all according to my own wishes rather than someone else's expectations. And if that made me a stranger to my son, if it made me unrecognizable to the woman I'd been for most of my life, then so be it. I'd spent 63 years being the person everyone else needed me to be. The time had finally come to discover who I was when no one was watching, when no one was expecting anything, when the only voice that mattered was my own. Outside my window, the city hummed with its endless cycle of ambition and disappointment, love and betrayal, hope and resignation. Somewhere in that maze of lights and dreams, my son was learning what it felt like to need something from someone who had no reason to give it. Somewhere out there, a mother was discovering that her love had been taken for granted one too many times. But here, in my small apartment with my books and my tea and my hard-won independence, I was finally, completely, unapologetically myself. And that, I was learning, was enough. They called me a stranger. Now I finally am one by choice. And for the first time in my life, that doesn't frighten me at all.